What if there was an author out there who is trying to compile together all of human knowledge across all of time into one coherent theory and system? Well, it turns out there is somebody out there doing this, and there's actually a couple of people doing it. But the person I want to introduce you to today is somebody called Ken Wilber. He's been doing this for many, many decades now, and it's his idea of integral psychology. How do we combine all human knowledge into one big system of theories, or one big meta theory? Now, there's two reasons why I'm recommending this book today. First of all, because of the depth of this, and I'll start to explain why in a second in terms of what the book's actually about. But the most pressing one is, how do you actually tackle a big book? Now, when I refer to a big book, the average book that I'm recommending, if we go back to just a few books ago, like The Courage to Teach, that's about a standard book length when we start to look at it in terms of this. The book that I'm recommending today in comparison is this instead. It's this absolute tome, this big, thick, chunky book. So when we look at a book like this, which is roughly 900 pages in length, first of all, it's realizing, how do you see yourself in terms of a book like that? If you'd have asked me a few years ago when I was not a reader in the slightest, and if you're new to this channel, by the way, my name is Billy Clark. People call me Mr. Clark, given that I've been a teacher of philosophy for 10 years, and I'm currently building a library of psychology and philosophy books, all with the idea of guiding your inner work and your self-discovery. And I was not a reader at all when I began this process. It took me about a month to read about 250 pages. I was very, very scattered and distracted. And if you'd have said to me at that point in time, I want you to read a 900-page book, I would have just laughed at you and just said that it's just not happening whatsoever. So first of all, when we start to think about a book like this, we've got to think that actually reading isn't just a process that's happening on just any one level. It's not just a physical process or a mental or an emotional or even a spiritual one. It's all of them combined. And if I didn't have the self-esteem to be able to chip away at something like this, or the ability to be consistent, I would never ever get that done. I'd be thinking, in relation to a book like this, who am I to read it? Maybe somebody else can, but I can't. For no real reason other than, realistically, it's just a bit too difficult. Whether that might be in terms of content or in terms of length. Basically, what I've done is I've realized there's a challenge here and that I'm not up for a challenge. That's all I would have thought when I originally started. So really, for me to be able to read a book like this, and I've now since read multiple, what you might call like big books, if we talk about them as being over 500 pages, it's understanding that there's a certain amount of courage that is taken, that is needed, to be taken on an undertaking like this, where you're trying to grapple with a book like this. It's not about understanding every single word on every single page and memorizing it. And I think that's what the modern education system, especially as a teacher and having been inside it, is really, it's how it's put a lot of people off reading overall. A lot of people associate reading with memorization, and it's just not relevant beyond GCSEs, beyond A-levels. It's just not practical. And I want to really get people in touch with loving reading again. I don't remember every word in this, obviously, but I remember a good 10, 15 concepts and how I actually apply them in my life. And that's why it's particularly useful to be able to tackle a book like this. Is to be able to, first of all, realize that there's a certain amount of courage and you need to rely on certain values and traits, maybe that you might associate in other areas of your life, but that they actually apply in areas like this as well. You might see yourself as courageous or very disciplined out in the real world in terms of the physical aspect of this, but how can we actually also try to move that over into the mental world and the emotional world? Now, I'm using these words on purpose because when I talk about this book, you'll probably have seen the title of it already by now, but Sex, Ecology and Spirituality by Ken Wilber. What he's trying to do here is try to understand how can we fit all of human development into what he refers to as a 4-quadrant approach, AQAL, all quadrants, all lines. It also goes into multiple areas. It's realizing that on any given point, we've got the individual and we've got the collective. So if we imagine this as like a little grid that goes up and down, we've got the individual and we've got the collective. So there's me and there's the community. But equally, we've got the interior and the exterior. We've got what happens on the inside and what happens on the outside. And if we think about that as a quadrant approach, you've got what happens inside me as an individual, so my thoughts, my first person awareness. You've got what happens on the outside of me in terms of my biology. Things where if you were to cut me open, you could see what my brain is doing, what my organs are doing. You could look at my my body in a third person way, if we describe it as like an it, like an object. If we start to look at it down here in this other quadrant, we might start to see what it's like to be inside of the collective when we start to think about things like culture and how we make sense of certain words and certain terms in our language. And in this bottom corner over here in the lower right, it's the external approach of the collective. So what systems are in place? Let's think about like the governmental approach, the world status that we're in at this point in time. What's actually happening at the time of recording in 2025 in Britain, in the north of the UK, which is where I'm living at this point. So that's like the systems approach. What we're trying to do is we're trying to understand when we think about an idea, how does that same idea apply to each of those areas? Take, for example, the example of anxiety. If you're an anxious person, then there's what that means to you individually as someone who is experiencing anxiety. But at the same time, we can't just reduce everything down to just that experience. We need to also move it over here. We need to think, what is your body actually doing when you are experiencing anxiety? What are the hormonal imbalances that are happening? What's physically going on in your body? But when we start to think about that as well, let's move it over into the other corner. So what's going on when your family talks about anxiety? What does the language of the people around you say, and what does it truly mean when they talk about anxiousness? And if we move that over then over here into the bottom right hand corner, it's what is the general understanding in the world around you when you think about anxiety? What does the government think about anxiety? If you're at school and you're a child watching this, what is the general opinion of anxiety within that school? What are the systems that are around you that hold that in place as well? And all of a sudden you can start to see that just this example of anxiety on its own, it can't be reduced to any of these one areas. To understand the other person who is in front of me, especially as a teacher and as a coach, I need to understand from their perspective what it is for them to be anxious. And I can only understand that by actually asking them, by actually having that conversation from subject to subject. Now, it might be there that we have questions around the truthfulness of a person. We might start to ask, is that person telling the truth or not? And how do I even start to understand and check whether that person is telling the truth or not? Compared to over here, we might start to look at the objective truth of the matter. When I say this particular hormone is out of balance, that's checkable, that's falsifiable. We can start to see, is that actually true? We don't actually have to speak to the person to realize that. So we can actually see what's going on in their body and actually start to correct it in that way. So already we've got this other distinction that's coming out. Truthfulness on one side versus truth. Subjective versus objective. I can only find out the truthfulness of a person by speaking to them. Whereas I can find the truth of the matter by looking at the facts. It's the idea of if somebody was going to be creating a map to be able to go on a journey, to link it on the previous book in this series, that's fine. But how do we trust the map maker themselves? Are they a trustworthy and reliable source? Comes back to the same idea. The truthfulness and the trustability, if you like, of that map maker is very different as to whether that map itself can be trusted. As you can start to see just from that very, very simple grid that I've tried to illustrate as graphically as possible on here, just using my hands, you can start to see how something like this starts to go into so many areas. So if you imagine this is someone who is trying to understand life on a physical level, emotional level, mental level, spiritual level, on the level of the shadow as well. So what's available to us, but in an unconscious way. And how do we then start to understand that life in all of its different ways can't be reduced down to any of these quadrants? How do we then start to navigate life? How do we then start to realize the nuance of what's going on in each of these areas? It's a book like this that helps to unpick just so much which we might just take for granted. And just sticking with that one example of anxiety, you can start to see suddenly anxiety isn't just to do with me. It's not just to do with you. It's not just to do with your body or your culture or the people that are around you at this point in time or where you live. It's all of them all at once. And that can't be reduced. There's a complexity to it which we have to engage with. And that's what a book like this has really helped me with. It's realizing that sometimes I'm jumping straight to very, very simple conclusions. Here's the problem, and as a result, here's the solution. And that doesn't work for the majority of that quadrant approach. So when I think about any problem that I'm having or any person that I'm trying to meet, I'm trying to understand where is it that they're putting their bias? Where is it that they're preferring on these quadrants to be able to understand an idea? And realizing that if some of them have been pushed out, it's trying to reintroduce that understanding. Just because I can talk to you and understand how you feel anxious, and I can look at your body and understand that, if you're returning to a home which is itself reinforcing that anxiety, that needs to be called into question as well. And another book in this series is going to have a look at the anthropological approach to all this when we start to introduce the idea of how is architecture itself having an impact. But that's exactly why I want to be able to introduce a book like this, because as you can imagine, I'm barely even scratching the surface when I'm talking about some of the ideas that are in here. But first of all, how is it that you are able to think of yourself as someone who could even face a big book like this? And then from within that, how can you be able to extract some really practical insights about what to actually do with a lot of that knowledge? Again, it's not about memorization. It's not about being able to recall all of this from the top of your head. Nothing like that. It's just have an insight and then go out into the world and have a real impact based on that insight. All of these books in this series, that's what they're all based on. Have an insight and do something about the insight. It's not about packing and stacking up insights one after another if they're just going to go like rotting into waste. There's another book later in this series called Philosophy as a Way of Life. That is the embodiment of what all of this is about. Have an idea, decide how to act, and then gather the knowledge on that action itself as you're making that stand in the world. We need to try to maybe readdress the balance that as the modern world understands it, which is typically gather your knowledge first and then go and act. In this case, make the decisive commitment towards life and then gather the required knowledge that's going to be relevant on the way, and everything will be revealed to you as you do this. I love this book. I love it. I could talk about it all day, but Sex, Ecology, Spirituality by Ken Wilber. I don't think you need me to say that you're going to have a difficult, confronting, eye-opening time with a book like this. And even better, I found this in my local Oxfam for £4. So that's a pretty good insight per page per pound barrier. So yeah. The Spirit of Evolution is the subtitle to this book, and I think that is, again, another perfect encapsulation. If you want to carry on this series with even more book recommendations, keep on going. I'll be waiting for you in the next video. I'll see you over there.